December 10th, 1936. Fort Belvedere, Edward's country retreat near Windsor, sits quiet in the winter gray. Somewhere inside it, 326 days into his reign, King Edward VIII is signing the Instrument of Abdication. His three brothers, Albert, Henry, and George, are in the room as witnesses. He reads the document aloud, then puts his name to it. They countersign. It takes perhaps 15 minutes. The following evening, December 11th, he speaks on BBC radio for the last time as king. Listeners across Britain and the Empire hear him say, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." Queen Mary does not hear this in the same building as her son. She won't be in the room with him when he signs. She has written him a letter during the crisis. It changed nothing. Her documented response, when it settles into words, arrives with the precision of a woman who has spent 69 years organizing her feelings into positions. "The person who needs most sympathy is my second son. He is the one who is making the sacrifice." Her second son is Albert, the stammering, anxious, deeply reluctant man about to be crowned George VI, handed the weight of the British Empire because his older brother refused to carry it. Albert never wanted the throne. Albert has a debilitating stammer that speech therapist Lionel Logue had been working on for years. Albert is being conscripted into the central role of his civilization without adequate preparation, against his will, at 40 years old. Mary's sympathy runs to him, not to David, who is leaving. The statement is a complete portrait of her psychological orientation. Her eldest son's need, his decades-long, documented, structurally consistent emotional need, registers in her assessment as nothing more than dereliction of duty. Albert is suffering what has been done to him. David is simply failing. These are, for Mary, entirely different categories. The conventional version of the abdication is a love story. King meets American socialite, becomes obsessed, establishment refuses to accept her, King chooses her over the crown. That account is accurate as far as it travels. What it doesn't explain is why a man would walk away from the most powerful position in the British Empire rather than live without a particular woman. What it treats as a personality quirk is, in the fuller picture, the last visible symptom of a wound that had been open for 42 years. To understand December 1936, you need June 1894. A nursery at White Lodge in Richmond Park, a newborn called David, and the woman who visited him twice a day, handed him back when he cried, and returned to her duties. Mary of Teck was born on May 26, 1867, the daughter of Prince Francis of Teck, German aristocracy, morganatic birth, no significant fortune, and Princess Mary Adelaide, a granddaughter of George III and a first cousin of Queen Victoria. The family's social position was impeccable. Their finances were a recurring catastrophe. Mary Adelaide was large, warm, enormously popular, and perpetually in debt. The family spent a period living on the European continent, Florence primarily, then various German relations, while their English creditors were given time to be managed. Mary Adelaide was what her daughter would largely not become in public life: instinctively affectionate, genuinely expansive, someone who moved through the world with easy emotional generosity. She was called the People's Princess of her day, decades before that phrase attached to anyone else. She was also irresponsible with money on a scale that embarrassed everyone around her and forced her family into exile. Her daughter Mary absorbed much from that childhood. She took the lesson of financial chaos and social precariousness and distilled it into an absolute. The performance of propriety isn't optional. When circumstances humiliate you, you maintain composure. You present correctly. The surface holds even when everything beneath it's fracturing. Newly discovered letters from later in her life show she was capable of genuine warmth and kindness, but the woman the world encountered most often had built formidable defenses around that capacity, and the children who needed it most rarely reached it. Her father, Prince Francis, helped cement this lesson through his own behavior. He was, by the accounts of people who knew the household, a bully, domineering, difficult, harsh. Mary learned early what a lifetime in proximity to a harsh man required. You adapt. You contain yourself. You don't argue with the authority in the room. You perform compliance so completely it eventually becomes you. She was 24 in December 1891 when she became engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the Prince of Wales's eldest son, second in line to the throne. 6 weeks later, Albert Victor was dead of influenza, January 14th, 1892. Mary's planned future, her position, her entire carefully arranged trajectory, gone. She was sent to Florence to recover. 15 months after Albert Victor's death, she was engaged to his younger brother George, Duke of York. She married him May 6, 1893. The transition was accomplished with what observers noted as remarkable efficiency. George and Mary had known each other for years. The arrangement was sensible. Whether Mary had romantic feeling for either brother in any particular degree, what the substitution cost her, or whether she grieved Albert Victor beyond social propriety, she didn't say, and nobody pressed. She performed the duty assigned to her. She became Duchess of York, then Princess of Wales, then Queen Consort, at each stage with the same iron composure. She was genuinely intelligent. She spoke several languages with fluency, developed into a formidable expert on English and European decorative arts, and accumulated both extraordinary knowledge and an extraordinary personal collection: porcelain, furniture, snuff boxes, miniatures. She could identify pieces by period and provenance in seconds. She was cultivated, she was disciplined, and she had somewhere in the long journey from an impoverished German household, through a double engagement and an arranged royal marriage, built walls around spontaneous feeling that she experienced, not as loss, but as achievement. Philip Ziegler, in his assessment of her, chose the phrase, "a jeweled automaton." Shy, stiff, and bloodless, he said. A woman who sometimes displayed affection toward her children. The qualifier, sometimes, doing heavy lifting. Her husband was George V, naval-trained, formally hierarchical, constitutionally unable to distinguish between the emotional requirements of a ship's crew and those of his own children. He was terrifying to his family. This is documented, not inferred. His sons shook in his presence. What he considered paternal authority they experienced as the particular dread of a man whose displeasure had no limit and no predictable trigger. George V ran his household by rank, by rules, and by the principle that weakness in any form was contemptible. He was, if anything, more demanding of his children than of his officers, because his children had no formal mechanism of transfer or resignation. The fear he induced was total and permanent. One account, widely attributed to him and consistent with every behavioral record of his parenthood, that his father was frightened of his mother, that he was frightened of his father, and that he was damned well going to see to it that his children were frightened of him. Whatever the precise origin of that phrasing, the program it describes is documented. He executed it faithfully. Mary was herself afraid of him. The interviews James Pope Hennessy conducted while researching his biography of Mary, interviews with courtiers, household staff, and family acquaintances who spoke candidly because they were speaking privately, surfaced this plainly. One of those interviewees, Daisy Bigg, spoke about Mary in terms that remain the sharpest contemporaneous assessment on record. Mary was, in Big's phrase, a moral coward. She wouldn't say a single thing when George treated the children harshly, because she respected him too much as a monarch. Moral coward isn't a mild accusation. It implies specific knowledge of a specific harm, combined with the standing and capacity to intervene, combined with a deliberate choice not to. Big, who knew the family from the inside, was describing someone who understood that her children needed protection and withheld it anyway, because the cost of challenging George V's authority was too high for her to pay. The combination these parents produced, together, was maximally damaging. A father who ruled through fear, and a mother who functioned as a second enforcer of the father's standards rather than a refuge from them. In a household organized this way, there is nowhere to go. No parent who absorbs the impact, no adult relationship that models what warmth looks like, no evidence in the daily environment that a child's distress registers as a priority for any adult with the power to act on it. David had nowhere to go. Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David was born on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge, Richmond Park, the first child of George and Mary. 7 names. The family called him David, his last name, his private name. 6 children would follow across the next 11 years: Albert in December 1895, Mary in 1897, Henry in 1900, George in 1902, and John in 1905. From birth, the children were placed in the care of nursery staff. This was the convention of the class. Victorian and Edwardian upper-class children were raised primarily by nannies and governesses, not by their parents. The argument that Mary's approach was simply typical of her era is real and should be stated directly. It has force. Twice-daily parental visits weren't unusual. Physical demonstrativeness between aristocratic parents and their children wasn't the norm. The nursery as a separate sphere of the household was standard architecture, not exceptional neglect. The argument has one problem. It accounts for the structure, but not for what happened inside the structure. And what happened inside the royal nursery during David's infancy wasn't standard. The head nurse assigned to David's care from birth had discovered a method that was efficient and comprehensive. Before presenting the infant to his parents for their twice-daily visits, she would pinch him. Not a warning touch, a deliberate, hard pinch, applied precisely to produce immediate, genuine distress. The baby would be carried screaming into the drawing room. He would be handed to his mother. Mary, already uncertain and awkward with her children, would hold a screaming infant at arm's length. She would give him back. The nurse would return to the nursery, the door would close, and she would have the child to herself again. The visit ended before it could produce any relationship. Picture the sequence in its daily repetition. The nurse lifts David from his cot. She pinches him. The baby screams, the full-body pre-verbal distress of an infant in sudden pain. She carries him down the corridor. She presents him to his mother with the neutral expression of professional service. Mary reaches for the child. The child is screaming. Mary holds him for a moment, uncertain, unable to soothe him, feeling whatever a woman who is already uncomfortable with children, including her own, feels when handed a screaming baby by a nurse who is watching. She gives him back. The nurse retreats. The door closes. This happened twice a day. It happened when David was a week old, when he was a month old, 6 months, a year. Albert was born in December 1895, a year and a half after David, and the same nurse began applying the same method to him. 2 small boys, systematically hurt before every encounter with their parents, their screaming bodies efficiently used to terminate every possibility of sustained maternal contact before it could begin. The abuse continued across the entire period of the nurse's employment. Charlotte Jane Bill, born December 9, 1875, entered royal service on April 2, 1897, as an under-nurse in the household of the Duke and Duchess of York, at York Cottage, Sandringham. She was 21 years old. She came in below the head nurse in rank. Sometime around her arrival, the precise trigger is disputed across sources, the head nurse was dismissed. Bill was promoted to replace her. David was 2 years and 9 months old when Charlotte Bill arrived. The maximum possible duration of the pinching covers almost his entire conscious infancy. Every encounter he had ever had with being presented to his mother had been preceded by deliberate pain. His entire experience of that specific situation, the carrying down the corridor, the doorway, the handing over, was coded in his body as the prelude to distress. Mary, upon eventually learning what had been happening, was described as astounded. The word is precise, and it's damning. Not gradually suspicious, not reluctantly confronting what she'd worried about. Astounded. Completely surprised. Which means that across twice daily contact with a screaming infant, across nearly 3 years of visiting a child who consistently cried the moment he was handed to her, she had not once arrived at the question of what might be causing it. She had an answer that required no further inquiry. A difficult child, a constitutional disposition toward upset, the baby's temperament, rather than the baby's circumstances. The failure to see isn't a technical failure, not a structural gap in the aristocratic childcare system. Other parents in the same system, with the same twice-daily visits, with the same nursery arrangements, did ask questions. The failure is attentional. Mary brought to those twice-daily visits the same quality of engagement she brought to everything involving her children. Distant, documentary, uncomfortable. She recorded the stages of his development in photograph albums. She didn't look at him. The BBC would later report on this period explicitly. The future Edward VIII and George VI were abused by one of their early nannies. Both. The nanny's method affected Albert as fully as David. The 2 eldest sons of the House of Windsor spent their infancy being systematically hurt before every encounter with their parents, by a woman their parents employed without adequate supervision, in a nursery their parents visited without adequate attention. Charlotte Bill, Lala to the children, the nickname that would attach to her for the next several decades, changed the nursery entirely. She was, in the consistent testimony of those who knew the family, effective and much loved. She was present in the way that the previous arrangement had specifically prevented. She paid attention. She noticed things. She was warm without being sentimental, attentive without being indulgent, precisely the qualities the job required and that the household had previously been systematically lacking. She became the organizing, emotional figure of the royal nursery. All 6 children passed through her care over the years that followed. Prince John, the youngest child, who developed epilepsy and was largely kept from public life, living quietly at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, died under Lala Bill's care in January 1919 at the age of 13. Not his mother's care, Lala's. David never lost the connection to her. Into his adult life, he visited her at Wood Farm. After the abdication crisis, after the entire structure of his royal life had collapsed and he'd left England for France as the Duke of Windsor, she wrote to him. A man in his 40s, formerly King of England, a man who had just chosen personal love over an empire, still in correspondence with the woman who had run his nursery. The attachment was real, and it was lasting. She was what Mary largely wasn't. She appeared. She noticed. She provided the consistent daily warmth that creates, in a child's nervous system, the baseline sense of being someone's concern. The fact that this was a paid professional rather than his mother isn't a complexity to be managed in the narrative. It's the point. David came of age inside a family organized by fear. He went to Osborne Naval College and then Dartmouth, then briefly to Magdalen College, Oxford, then into the First World War, where the government refused to let him serve in combat because the heir apparent couldn't be killed in a trench. He spent the war in staff positions near the front, visiting units, maintaining morale, watching other men his age die while he was managed like a national asset and deployed for ceremonial purpose. He found the situation humiliating and said so repeatedly to anyone who would listen. It was among the earliest documented instances of a quality that would define his reign, his personal emotional reality, pressing against the requirements of his role with no ability to contain the friction. By 1911, when he was formally invested as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle, the world beyond the family had decided he was extraordinary. The newspapers called him the most photographed man alive. He was blonde, slight, elegant, and possessed what seemed like a democratic ease that contrasted with every piece of royal furniture that surrounded him. He shook hands. He looked people in the eye. He seemed to belong to the century he was living in rather than the century that had produced him. None of that was the man in private. The man in private was still looking for what the nursery had never provided. In March 1918, during a German Zeppelin raid on London, the 23-year-old Prince of Wales took shelter in a house in Belgrave Square. A married woman named Winifred May Dudley Ward was also sheltering there. Born on July 28, 1894, the same year as Edward, she was technically his peer in age, but his superior in every dimension that structured the relationship. She had two daughters, Penelope, born 1914, and Claire, born 1916, a settled social world, and a marriage to William Dudley Ward that had long since deteriorated to a formality of shared address. She was known as Frida. Edward telephoned her within days of the Belgrave Square meeting. Within weeks, they were involved. The relationship would last 16 years. His letters to her during this period are among the more clinically useful documents in the history of the abdication, because they show not what he wanted anyone to think he felt, but what he actually felt. The letters, in the assessment of historians who have read them, show extreme self-deprecation. He called himself an awful bore. He used what biographers describe as childish, insecure language, the phrasing of a man who genuinely does not believe he deserves to be kept, who is perpetually surprised to find he is still wanted, who apologizes before there is anything to apologize for. The Prince of Wales, one of the most publicly admired men in the British Empire, wrote private love letters that read as though authored by someone who expected to be abandoned and was working constantly to prevent it. When they were separated, he traveled extensively, as the role required, conducting tours of Canada, Australia, India. He called her. Not once or twice, 4 or 5 times a night. Her household developed a name for these calls, the baker's call, because they arrived with the reliability and frequency of a morning delivery. He needed the contact the way some people need water, in the sense that its absence produced immediate functional distress. Frida admonished him for using bad language. She set the emotional temperature of the relationship and held it according to her own preferences, not his. When she wanted more distance, he felt it immediately and struggled. When she pulled back, he came close to breakdown on an overseas tour, the dependency on her emotional availability so complete that its withdrawal directly affected his ability to carry out public functions. He was the Prince of Wales, heir to the British Empire, and he was ringing a married woman 4 or 5 times a night from the far side of the world to make sure she still wanted him. Historians analyzing this relationship reach for the same word, maternal, not in a pathologizing shorthand way, but in the precise sense that the dynamic reproduced something specific. She provided correction, limits, and the experience of being emotionally managed by someone who cared enough to bother. She told him when he was behaving badly. She moderated his excesses. She was the adult in the dynamic, structurally and functionally, regardless of their identical birth years. What Edward experienced with Frida, being the less powerful person in an intimate relationship, finding the authority and attention of a controlling woman not just tolerable but essential, maps directly onto what he had never reliably received from his mother, and what his mother's abdication of that role had left him desperate for. The pattern wasn't random. It had been shaped by a specific absence, and it reproduced, in adult form, the precise shape of that absence. The relationship lasted until 1934, by which point Wallis Simpson had thoroughly replaced Frida in Edward's attention and affection. Frida found out when she rang one day and was told, by a switchboard operator who apparently had not been briefed on how to handle this specific situation, that the Prince of Wales would no longer be taking her calls. After 16 years, no explanation, no conversation, just the silence where the baker's call used to be. Thelma, Viscountess Furness, occupied the interlude between Frida and Wallis. American, twice married, known to contemporaries as a woman with what they consistently described as a dominant streak. She was possessing and authoritative in a way Edward found familiar, and she was also the person who introduced him to Wallis Simpson sometime in the early 1930s. That introduction, given what followed, has an inadvertent quality. One dominant woman handing Edward to a more extreme version of the same type. By the close of 1934, every biographical account of Edward agrees on the same description of his state regarding Wallis. Irretrievably besotted. Her personality, domineering, abrasive, dismissive by temperament, wasn't, to him, an obstacle to affection. It was the mechanism of attraction. The thing he needed was the thing she delivered most reliably. Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson was 40 in 1936, American, and had been married twice, to Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., an American naval aviator, divorced in 1927, and to Ernest Aldrich Simpson, a British-American businessman. Both former husbands were living. She was constitutionally impossible as a royal consort. The king was supreme governor of the Church of England, an institution that explicitly prohibited remarriage while a former spouse was alive. Both of Wallis's former spouses were alive. The constitutional problem wasn't an abstraction. What she provided Edward was something the constitutional framework had no category for. A 1975 analysis in the Journal of British Studies examining the psychological dimensions of the abdication and drawing on the academic framework of psychobiography concluded that Wallis represented the ideal mother image who was able to fill Edward's psychological need, that the specific combination of her personality matched the specific shape of his wound in a way none of the women before her had quite done. The BMJ's Medical Humanities Journal, publishing a separate analysis years later, framed the entire abdication as a study of estrangement between an adult son and elderly mother, locating the crisis not in Parliament or Lambeth Palace, but in the family structure that had produced Edward. Two entirely independent scholarly disciplines, working from different frameworks and different decades, arrived at the same address: the relationship between David and his mother as the explanatory foundation of December 1936. The accumulation of independent conclusions pointing in the same direction isn't coincidence, it's convergence. Wallis gave Edward what Mary had withheld: the experience of being someone's primary concern, expressed in the form of controlling attention. Her dismissiveness, the documented tendency to treat him with an authority that reversed every protocol around how a Prince of Wales was supposed to be addressed, wasn't incidental to his attraction. It was the attraction. He found her authority intoxicating in the precise sense that it reproduced something he had been seeking since the twice-daily visits that ended in crying. His abdication speech, listened to closely, isn't the language of romantic passion. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. Without the help and support. The crown is a burden too heavy to carry without a specific person providing structural support. This is the language of dependency, not devotion. A man of 42 describing the governance of the British Empire as functionally impossible without one particular woman is describing something that was shaped long before he met her. George V died on January 20th, 1936, at Sandringham. He was 70 years old. Edward became King Edward VIII within hours. The man who had terrified him his entire life was gone. The last authority above Edward within his own family, the voice that had designed the fear as a deliberate policy, the figure whose displeasure had organized his entire formative world, was removed. What remained was the constitutional weight of the crown and Wallis Simpson. Nothing else had meaningful leverage over him. He wasn't built for what the role required without someone beside him. Kingship, at the level George V had modeled it, demanded internal resources, a settled self, a capacity to draw on something interior when the isolation of ultimate authority bore down. George V had those resources because, whatever his faults as a father, he had a rigid self-concept that didn't bend. Edward had none of it. He had been given a nursery nurse who heard him before every maternal visit, a father who ruled by fear, and a mother who photographed the milestones without inhabiting them. The internal architecture wasn't there. His reign ran from January 20th to December 11th, 1936, 326 days. He continued seeing Wallis openly, refusing the discretion that the establishment expected and that previous royal companions had maintained. He took her on a yacht through the Adriatic in August 1936. He brought her to Balmoral. He failed or refused to understand that the role required managing appearances as a primary function of governance, and that Wallis was an appearance that couldn't be managed into acceptability. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin opened formal discussions with Edward in October 1936. The options were three: end the relationship with Wallis, abdicate, or pursue a morganatic marriage, a legal structure that would marry them without granting Wallis the title of Queen Consort. The cabinet rejected the morganatic option. On October 27, 1936, a court in Ipswich granted Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson. Two processes were running simultaneously and in opposite directions. Wallis becoming legally free to remarry, and every mechanism for that remarriage existing within the crown being foreclosed. Through November, newspaper proprietors across Britain maintained a voluntary silence about the crisis. Editors understood what was at stake and agreed not to publish, a decision that looks extraordinary from a modern vantage, but reflected the establishment's close management of the information environment. The dam broke in early December. By December 5th, the story was public across Britain. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace, to Downing Street, from people all over the empire who had opinions about what their king should do. Mary, in this period, wasn't merely a grieving bystander. One source indicates she was actively directing pressure through Lord Wigram, acting in her capacity as Dowager Queen to marshal the establishment forces, pushing Edward toward a decision. Edward had already decided. The only question remaining was form. He met with Baldwin for the last time on December 4th. The cabinet pleaded with him on December 9th to reconsider. On December 10th, he signed at Fort Belvedere, his brothers present, and it was done. He left England for France that night. He wouldn't return for years. returned to Mary in December 1936, watching the apparatus she'd spent her life maintaining come apart. She is genuinely baffled. Her documented statements from this period aren't the statements of a woman performing incomprehension. They are the statements of a woman who has actually encountered a value hierarchy she can't process. The person who needs most sympathy is my second son. He is the one who is making the sacrifice. I simply can't change now. The second statement is the more revealing one. It was offered in response to some suggestion that she might approach the crisis with more personal flexibility, more understanding of David's position, more of whatever it's that a mother might provide when her son is destroying himself in public. She said, "I simply can't change now." She was right. She couldn't. She had built herself across 69 years specifically to be unable to change. Because change, spontaneous, feeling-driven, adaptive change, was the thing that had been most dangerous in the environments that formed her. She looked at David and saw a man who had failed to execute a duty. She couldn't see, and apparently never did see, the through line from the nursery to the abdication. She had spent her entire adult life demonstrating that personal feeling is irrelevant to royal function, that the correct response to need is to absorb it silently and continue. She had transmitted this with the conviction of someone who experiences it as the highest available truth, and she had transmitted it so completely that she raised a son who spent 40 years quietly building, relationship by relationship, a private alternative structure, one woman after another who would provide what the official framework explicitly didn't: attention, warmth, the experience of being someone's primary concern. David's published memoir, A King's Story, released in 1951 while Mary was still alive, described her warmly. Her soft voice, her cultivated mind, her careful photograph albums. The memoir performed an affectionate relationship. In the private correspondence he wrote after her death in March 1953, after she was gone and the performance was no longer required, the assessments were harsher. He needed her to be dead before he could be honest about her. That gap between the public warmth and the private grievance maintained for decades is its own summary of what the relationship actually was. She died not knowing what she had built. Or, if some part of her knew, she had organized that knowledge, as she organized everything, into a place where it couldn't touch her. She died with the conviction that David had failed a test of character, the way a soldier fails to hold a position. Her job had been to prepare him. She had been meticulous about it. The photograph albums, the twice-daily visits, the careful documentation of every progressive stage. She hadn't noticed the pinching. She hadn't questioned the crying. She hadn't moderated his father. She had visited the nursery with the efficiency of a woman conducting an inspection and the engagement of a woman to whom these children, in the quiet testimony of those who knew her best, seemed almost to belong to someone else. She raised a king out of discipline, distance, and formal procedure. She handed him to a nurse she didn't check on. She left him in the orbit of a father she was afraid of and chose not to moderate. She visited twice daily, and when he cried, because a woman in the next room was hurting him, she gave him back and went about her day. And then, 42 years later, she watched, genuinely baffled, as the architecture of her entire life's work came apart in the space of 326 days. The woman who worshipped duty above all else raised the only British monarch in modern history to voluntarily abandon it. She spent December 1936 looking for a failure of character when she should have been looking at a nursery door she never truly opened. She built a king who needed love more than a crown. She never once considered that providing it was part of the job. The abdication wasn't a betrayal of everything she had worked for. It was the completion of it. Subscribe for more stories like this.